for president. In the 1930s, up through the 40s and into the 50s, this ominous-looking gentleman, Isidore Kid Cam Blumenfeld, was the underworld crime lord of Minneapolis, and he was reported to have spread his money around City Hall, and obviously he had a substantial influence. He was a bootlegger, and when Prohibition ended, he manipulated liquor licenses in Minneapolis. So I think that this corruption was certainly a key issue. People from St. Paul will be pleased to know that Lincoln Steffens never wrote The Shame of St. Paul. Modest corruption there, but nothing on the level of the situation in Minneapolis. The two cities also differed significantly in the economic sphere, as I indicated just a little while ago, and the labor relations particularly were contentious in Minneapolis, in large part because the city's economy was controlled by what some might call a cabal of the big business owners who came together through an organization called the Citzens Alliance. And the Citzens Alliance was dedicated to thwarting labor organizing and keeping Minneapolis an open shop town and preventing strikes. And they had a tight clamp on the local economy. The city's fledgling labor movement was obviously incredibly frustrated by this situation, and this frustration finally boils over in the 1930s in a series of very dramatic strikes, when a group of militant Teamsters decide to take on the Citzens Alliance. They were led by a quietly charismatic man named Vince Dunn. Vince Dunn had grown up sort of a hardscrabble life in northern Minnesota. He goes off to Montana, becomes a lumberjack, becomes involved with the International Workers of the World, the IWW, the Wobblies, becomes imbued with their concepts of class struggle, comes back to Minnesota, a committed ideologue. He becomes a communist, although in the Trotskyite wing of the Communist Party. But he was more than an ideologue. He was a very shrewd organizer and very pragmatic. He actually had a very responsible job. He was a weighmaster in the coal yards, and he uses his work in the coal yards to organize a small but successful strike in February of 1934. He's smart enough to know that when you call a strike in the coal yards, you do it on the very coldest day of the year when everybody is immediately calling for coal, and that's what he did, and the coal owners have to cave and actually agree to a modest wage settlement and some union recognition. So the next step, Vince and the Teamsters decide to take on the produce companies in the city's warehouse area, which is now basically where the Target Center is, just in front of where the new ballpark is. And in the summer of 1934, they engage in some very violent confrontations with the agents of the business owners, many of whom had been deputized by the police department. And many of these police deputies were actually from the very elite, wealthy families. And the story is that they didn't have work clothes, so they had to wear their hunting outfits down to fight the union workers. Here's a scene from what came to be known as the Battle of Deputy Run, where the Teamsters turn back the deputies. They turn tail and run. Actually, two of the deputies are killed during the melee in the Battle of Deputies Run in May. There is a second incident in July of 1934 when the police fire on unarmed strikers in the warehouse area. The police claimed that they were shooting over the heads of the strikers, but if you look closely at this photo, you see the police aiming directly at the strikers who are in this open-air truck, and two of the strikers are killed by the police. One of them, Mr. Ness, has a dramatic funeral. 100,000 people turn out for his funeral in downtown Minneapolis, and the city of Minneapolis seems on the verge of revolution. This is a very tense period, and it seems like the world is sort of coming apart here. Governor Floyd Olson is caught in the middle. during this time. His sympathies certainly laid with the strikers, but he is the governor of Minnesota and he feels that he has to maintain law and order, so he declares martial law, which doesn't please anybody. But then an interesting thing happens, and there is intervention from on high. On August 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt comes to Rochester, Minnesota, ostensibly to honor the Mayo brothers who had established the Mayo Clinic, and President Roosevelt meets with Governor Olson. Now, there's no direct account of that meeting, but historians are convinced that they clearly talked about this strike because it was the national administration in Washington had their eyes on Minneapolis. It was probably one of the most dramatic confrontations in what was otherwise a very difficult, bloody year. There were strikes all over the country, but the trucker strike was probably the most severe and the most contentious of all of them. So President Roosevelt meets with Floyd Olson. At the same time, a man named Rob Lee Kramer, who is the editor of the Minneapolis Labor Review, comes down to Rochester, and he meets with Louis Howe, who is Roosevelt's chief advisor, and there is an account of that meeting. And Rob Lee Kramer tells Louis Howe in no uncertain terms that the Roosevelt administration needs to put pressure on the business owners in Minnesota to settle the strike. And Howe knows that the Roosevelt administration has a key leverage point, and that's through an agency known as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, which was the TARP of its era. The TARP, well, I can't remember, Tom, what is it? Troubled Asset Recovery Program. The RFC provided a lifeline to the banks back in the 1930s during the height of the Depression, and if the RFC chose to withdraw their loans to the big banks, including Northwestern National Bank of Minnesota, it would have caused a lot of consternation in the Minneapolis Club. So, in fact, that's what happens after Roosevelt's meeting with Floyd Olson. The RFC does, in fact, intervene. Jesse Jones, the head of the agency, places some strategic calls to business owners in Minnesota, and almost immediately, in mid-August, the strike is settled. Here is the headline from the Minneapolis Journal, which was certainly not very sympathetic to the strike. Strike over, drivers back at work, martial rule ends. But here is a more triumphant headline in the Minneapolis Labor Review: truck drivers triumph in strike. And Rob Lee Kramer, who had great rhetoric, I love to read his articles because he just socked it to the bosses week after week, really pulled out all the stops in celebrating the settlement. Now, it wasn't as terrific as this headline indicates. There was some backsliding. It required elections in each of the trucking businesses, and while a number of the businesses were organized, it certainly wasn't the end of labor strife in Minneapolis. There were other bloody strikes, but at least there was a more level playing field, and the tight hold of the Citizens Alliance had been broken as a result of the trucker strike of 1934.